I think we'll make a start. We've had some delays due to the wonders of Southern Rail and train strikes and so on, but I'm delighted to see you all here. My name's Melissa Leach and I'm the Director of the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, and I'm really delighted to be opening this inaugural Digital Development Summit. And on behalf of the Institute, I'd like to thank, right at the outset, our co-organisers in the summit, the Web Foundation and Nesta, as well as our supporters, DFID, and also the DFID SRC Impact Initiative, as well, of course, as the host of fantastic speakers that we have lined up for you for the day ahead. So a very warm welcome to all of you here at the South Bank Centre today, and also to those of you watching and listening in online, where we'll be live streaming the first two sessions and the final session today. So what's this all about? We live today in a hyper-connected and multipolar world, replete, I think we would all agree, with global connections, global challenges, climate change, disasters, pandemics, conflict, but also global opportunities, new technologies and new collaborations. Much, I think, of what we need to do in this new world also speaks to a new model and way of working for development, addressing challenges that are both global and local at the same time, that aren't linear and unpredictable, but actually require understanding very dynamic, uncertain change, and that really importantly move away from the notion of development as something that happens only in so-called developing countries, towards a more universal framing of development as change that includes high and middle and low income countries alike. The challenge of ensuring decent work for all in a digital world is really emblematic of this new development world. And it's no doubt one of the biggest and most prominent development challenges of our time. I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say how struck I've been by the sheer volume of attention to this topic in recent weeks and months. It's almost impossible to open a newspaper, to log on to the blogosphere, to spend any time on Twitter without some new reference or article talking about the impact of technology on our lives and livelihoods. Indeed, the information and ideas on this topic have been emerging so fast that I know it's proved something of a challenge to the IDS team in putting together the background paper for this meeting. I'm sure you'll agree, actually, a really excellent background paper that, despite the rapidity of change, does a really good job of capturing where we're at in this debate and raising some of the challenges and the opportunities. I think the rapidity of change and of information also speaks to the popularity of this event, which amazingly was overbooked within a day of its being announced, and we've had to turn lots of people away. So those of you who are here in the room, you're very lucky to be here. Lots of people wish they were here and not. It's certainly, I think, one of the fastest filled conferences that IDS has ever organised. So just quickly, reading the summit background paper, there are a few things that for me really stood out. First, I think, is for those that imagine this to be a developed country problem, it's very striking that every recent report on the topic highlights the fact that it's developing countries, low and middle income countries, that are likely to be hit harder by digitisation or automation than the US and Europe. For instance, to cite just one, data from the World Bank analysed by the Oxford Martin School and Citibank show that susceptibility to automation is actually negatively correlated with GDP per capita. In other words, the poorer a country is, the more vulnerable it is. Second, much of the debate about the future of jobs has focused on the formal sector, partly perhaps because that's where the data are available more easily, with far less attention paid to the 2 billion, at least, working-age adults who are classified as being outside the workforce. Yet, of course, they're working. 82% of South Asians, about 66% of those in sub-Saharan Africa, 65% of people in East and South Asia, 51% of adults in Latin America work, but they do it in the informal economy. And very little attention has been paid to how automation and digitisation are affecting their lives and livelihoods. And thirdly, I'm struck by, despite the urgency of the issue, how so many international development actors are still largely unprepared for the sheer scale and rapidity of the changes that are afoot. the changes that could arise, and indeed that we're already seeing arising as a result of automation, digitisation. And this means that we need to understand better, but we need rather quickly to develop better policy frameworks, and we need to act better, all of us, whether we're academics, businesses, policymakers, practitioners, or those in government or civil society. So these are the reasons why we and our partners have focused this first 2017 Digital Development Summit on the future of work. We're hoping that this will give us an opportunity collectively to envisage and determine not just the challenges and the hazards ahead, but also perhaps ways in which the tide might be turned so that technologies and connectivities can actually seek to be used to reduce wealth inequalities and to accelerate sustainable livelihoods and inclusivity for everybody. But the stakes in this, I really must emphasise, couldn't be higher. And in my role, finally, as IDS Director, and I suppose as an anthropologist who's worked in lower middle income countries for all of my life, let me say that we can't do any of this without a grounded focus on people in all their diversity, their everyday lives, their livelihoods, their ways of being and getting on with each other and in the world. And we've ensured that that people focus is a running theme throughout the day. It's there in the keynotes. It's also very much in the participatory sessions that we've planned for later on. And it's for these reasons too that I'm especially pleased that we're able to showcase some of the work that's been supported by the ESRC-DFID Joint Fund for Poverty Alleviation, which has had this people character to it. And I think will really help to bring some of those lies into sharp focus for us as we hit these big issues through the day. So without more ado, I'd now like to hand over to Anne Jelimer of the Web Foundation, who is enormously well qualified to speak about these issues and is going to share with us some opening reflections. So Anne, if you'd like to come up here, over to you.
Thank you, Melissa, and let me echo Melissa's thanks as well to our co-organizers and to DFID for making this event possible. The Web Foundation, which I am the head of, was established by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, who famously gave his invention away for free to benefit humanity. And the foundation's work is grounded in his desire that his invention and digital technology more generally should truly be for everyone, and be controlled by and benefit everyone equally. So we focus on digital equality, and a few years ago, this might have meant connectivity only. How do we connect the unconnected in the developing world, the so-called digital divide? And indeed, that has been a pillar and a foundation of our work. But digital inequality also now means tackling inequalities in the skills and capacities that people have to appropriate digital tools, and also the power that they have or don't have to negotiate the changing rules of a digital society and economy, such as their rights and control over data, for example, and the type of work opportunities that they have access to and their rights in the workplace. We focus particularly on the rights of women and low-income groups in the Global South, and that's been the basis of this very interesting collaboration with IDS to investigate the future of work and livelihoods in a context of very rapid technological upheaval. Our research shows that the benefits of and power over digital technologies are already very unevenly spread, not only between societies, but also within them. For example, our research shows that women in the developing world are 50% less likely to have any online experience at all. And those who are online are 30 to 50% less likely than men to have the skills to be able to appropriate that technology for their own empowerment, controlling for other variables like education, wealth, and age. In our Web Index research, we found that looking at a large number of countries around the world, practically none of them outside the global north are systematically investing in digital skills. And the majority of countries have no systematic protection for people's digital rights. In fact, despite the good news that this year, for the first time, more than 50% of the world will be connected, The bad news is that the overwhelming majority of the world's population, over 6 billion of 7 billion people by our count, live in countries where either there are severe restrictions on digital rights, or are people who are totally cut off from the internet. So that does not provide a promising foundation for artificial intelligence and digital work opportunities to advance development or to reduce inequality. But it's not too late. There are still policy actions that can be taken. There are still possibilities to assert control at a technological level. So there's an urgent need to understand the further impact that artificial intelligence and the digital work opportunities, or the so-called gig economy, will have on human development in low and middle income countries. On the one hand, the UN last year in their Industrial Development Report estimated that automation of knowledge work in developing countries could generate approximately $1 to $1.3 trillion a year in added value. But on the other hand, as Melissa mentioned, as many as 65 to 85% of jobs in emerging and developing countries could be lost to automation. Many experts have warned this will not be like previous phases of the Industrial Revolution, where jobs were destroyed in one sector, like agriculture, but many more jobs and better jobs were generated in new sectors of the economy. Artificial intelligence and automation may well lead to jobless growth particularly in countries that have previously relied on low-wage export industries, such as the garment industry in Asia, or mining in much of Africa. And these countries are at risk of premature deindustrialization, which could close off their path to growth and job creation. And that is a particularly distressing problem in countries like South Africa, where I have lived and worked for over 16 years, and where Minister Holomisa, who we'll hear from in a few minutes, is responsible for creating employment and ensuring a more equitable society. The reality is that women and informal sector workers are likely to be the hardest hit, as they are the least organized and protected to resist job losses, and the least skilled and equipped to benefit from the new jobs and opportunities that may be created. In South Africa, for example, it is, of course, as you know, one of the most unequal countries in the world, with a Gini coefficient of about 65. Unemployment is around 35%, counting discouraged workers, and 54% among young people. So over half of young people ages 15 to 35 are out of work. The National Planning Commission put together a study a few years ago of the chances of a young African woman who entered school in South Africa in 1999, just before the turn of the century. About 25% of her cohort will qualify for admission to university, 1 in 4. About 4% of those will actually go to university. Only 25% of that 4% will find work in the first 5 years after they graduate. Only 2% of all Tandy's contemporaries will earn the median wage in their lifetime. Across Africa as a whole, only 1% of African children are leaving school with basic coding skills. So the chances of a young African woman in South Africa to find employment and decent employment are already desperately low. What will happen if, as some estimates predict, between 40 and 65% of jobs currently existing in South Africa are lost to automation? These challenges raise very complex and difficult questions that urgently require debate, and that's why we're so pleased to be here to start the dialogue with you today. We think it's important to look both at the analog foundations for new technological innovation and artificial intelligence in particular to benefit the whole of humanity, as well as the digital foundations. So clearly, when it comes to analog foundations, complete transformation of education systems, or rethinking of social policy, including the possibility of universal basic income, And new ways of organizing both work and workers will be critical, as will changes to the taxation system. We already struggle to tax a digital economy fairly and effectively. Again, the rise of automation and artificial intelligence-driven technologies will demand further changes to the way that the value added through these technologies is taxed so that developing countries don't lose out further. The digital foundations also need to be addressed. So the code that underlies artificial intelligence, the platforms that can be used to build new technologies using artificial intelligence, should those be proprietary or should those be open in the same way that Tim Berners-Lee ensured that the web itself was open and non-proprietary? What about the data that powers artificial intelligence and makes it so effective? Who owns and controls that data? Is it my data because it's about me? Does it belong to Facebook or Google because I've signed their terms of service? What is the balance between personal control over data and commercial control over data? And how do we negotiate that balance in a way that enables artificial intelligence built on that data to benefit all of us? So those are the questions that we'll start to dig into today, and I hope that building on today's discussions, we'll be able to move forward to collective envisioning across different sectors, government, civil society, academia, trade unions, to determine and ultimately implement some of the solutions that will ensure that artificial intelligence and automation benefit everybody and lead to a more equal instead of a less equal society. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That's certainly a huge set of extremely provocative questions and challenges. And I'm now extremely honoured to turn to our next opening speaker, who is Patekile Holomisa, Deputy Minister for Labour of South Africa, where they are doing an enormous amount to confront precisely the problems that concern to us today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Where I come from, when people greet you, you respond and say good morning to me. I do not know if the organizers of this event knew that I am a male person, considering the gender bias of my fellow panelists here on my but nonetheless, Program Director, I am truly honored and delighted to have been invited to participate in this important conference held under the auspices of the Institute of Development Studies and its partners. I'm here to give a South African perspective to the discussions taking place on workplace developments that seem to have the pace and the momentum of their own. South Africa's transition from apartheid to a democratic state has been a success. In the past 20-odd years, we have built democratic institutions, we have transformed the public service, we have extended basic services, we have stabilized the economy, and we have taken our rightful place in the family of nations. I imagine that is why we are also here today. Despite these successes, too many of our people are trapped in poverty. Too few South Africans work, as has just been indicated here. The quality of school education for the majority is still of poor quality. Despite significant progress and efforts by government, in collaboration with all social partners, the journey to address the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment is further complicated by digitization. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure whether to be optimistic or pessimistic about the changes that are taking place. I'm optimistic though because the technological revolution brings with it the promise of us creating new jobs for the millions of the unemployed, most of them the youth that have never been in any formal job. I'm pessimistic at the same time because the technological changes have the potential to undo some of the gains in sectors which have created jobs. The results of the quarterly labor force survey for the fourth quarter of 2016 showed a slight decline in the unemployment rate to 26.5%. This is still 2 percentage points higher compared to the same period last year. There are still 8.9 million persons who did not have work but wanted to work. The youth aged between 15 and 34 remain vulnerable in the labor market with an unemployment rate of 37.1%, which is 10.6 percentage points above the national average. The challenge for us as policymakers is to be aggressive in undertaking programs that make existing workers adapt to the changing demands of the workplace. At the same time, there should be a focus on preparing the new workforce to take up the new technology-biased jobs through appropriate education and skills programs. South Africa, through the National Development Plan Vision 2030, attempts to create an environment of lifelong learning to help workers remain relevant in times of rapid change. The optimist in me suggests that although technology might displace some forms of work, many more opportunities will also be created as a result. For instance, I see a growth in the services sector, the sales force, a rapid growth in self-employment fueled by the demand of the services. The agriculture sector also has the potential to provide employment, as there will be a growth in the demand for food and other agriculture products, which, in spite of mechanization, still embodies labor-intensive activities. South Africa is also well endowed with natural beauty, and it is anticipated that the tourism and hospitality sector will continue to see positive job growth. Program Director, looking through the vast array of jobs available on the public employment system, one can see that whilst there is a decline in many jobs that technology has obliterated, there are certain jobs that cannot easily be automated. For instance, demand has increased for chefs, waiters, tourism workers, plumbers, home healthcare workers, and others doing service work that is nearly impossible to automate. The interactions between employers and employees through conventional means of collective bargaining to set conditions of employment and wages will surely diminish as the formal job as we know it disappears in favor of greater self-employment. The traditional workplace, where the manager oversees the activities of the workers, is also changing to a state where supervision and control are done from the outside or through service agreements. This serves to promote more independence for the workers and commitment towards the goals of business. How do we as policymakers adapt our regulations to the new trend of collective bargaining through technology? Even though people are not organized in a formal work environment, technology platforms have become the de facto employment environment in which the self-employed and those in the services sector can still become very powerful groups that exert pressure on policymakers. In South Africa, we recently saw the power of technology being used by students to bring about a zero-fees dispensation at universities under the banner of #fees must fall. Our department provides the Strengthening Civil Society Fund to help social partners navigate the changes that are taking place in the labor market. We anticipate a strong increase in the capacity of this fund to strengthen civil society to adapt to the changes being ushered in by the technology revolution. We have also recently improved social security for unemployed workers by extending unemployment insurance coverage from 8 months to 12 months. This includes domestic workers, farm workers, and those working in private households. The Department of Labor has recently spent more than 12 billion rand in the form of unemployment benefit support to workers that lost their jobs due to plant closures, downsizing, liquidations, and so on. There has also been direct funding for active labor market programs aimed at reskilling workers and improving productivity. A 500 million rand fund to stimulate growth in the agriculture sector is also being planned. Highly skilled artisans need to be refocused as the new demands for cleaner energy, biofuels, and alternative sources of energy require new sets of skills that currently do not exist. The department also has recently finalized discussions for the introduction of a national minimum wage to come into effect in May 2018. South Africa has not been a huge recipient of the low-cost manufacturing and business process outsourcing boom that has created many jobs in developing countries. This to some extent means that the policies need to be focused on preparing the workforce for the new wave of digital jobs that will be created. South Africa has a huge unemployment youth problem, which, even though it contributes to the cycle of poverty and inequality, also presents a powerful opportunity to capitalize on this new youth development. Gatherings such as these contribute value, insights, and lessons to chart the future policy direction. For organizations and companies to remain relevant in the knowledge economy, it is incumbent on leadership to promote and encourage innovative ways to better enable positive workplace transformation. Program Director, the effect of computer technology advances and improved automation has been suspected of contributing to sluggish employment growth in the South African labor market during the last 10 years, as indeed is the case elsewhere in the world. There is doom for existing workers and new entrants to the labor market who do not acknowledge the impact of digitization on the world of work, the fourth industrial revolution, as it is being dubbed. Many typical jobs are disappearing, not only in manufacturing, clerical and retail work, but in professions such as law, financial services, education, and medicine. To illustrate the point, the first disappearing job is that of the postman, as electronic mail has made the manual delivery of mail virtually obsolete. On a lighter note, Program Director, I'm not sure if the engineers are working on capturing the nostalgia and emotion that is associated with the postman walking down the street delivering the mail. Traditional typist almost does not exist any longer, as new workers that are more computer literate prepare their own reports and documents. Typists that have morphed themselves into data capturers have been able to successfully adapt and have gained benefits in increased demand, whilst those that have not have been marginalized to unemployment. The South African labor market is also fast experiencing the disappearance of the traditional wisdom that jobs and economic growth increase as productivity increases. Instead, analysts now talk of the concept of jobless growth, where productivity continues to rise robustly, yet employment is on a downward slide. Many researchers are confident that the technology is behind both the healthy growth in productivity and the weak growth in jobs. Technology boosts productivity and creates more wealth, yet there is an erosion of many types of jobs, leaving the typical worker worse off than before. This phenomenon makes the absorption of the new entrants and the placement of older workers into job opportunities almost impossible. Labor markets are experiencing a great paradox in that even though technology is simplifying the lives of workers and workers are becoming more creative as they adapt to new forms of work, workers are still worse off due to shrinking job opportunities. Reskilling and reorientation of workers are of critical importance. Education and training play an important role in labor market outcomes. For instance, statistics show that those with an education level of less than matriculation certificates make up 59% of the unemployed, with the unemployment rate of 31.2%. On the other hand, the unemployment rate among graduates was 7% in Q4 of the year 2016. It is now common knowledge that technological change has been destroying jobs faster than it is creating them, contributing to low income growth and the deepening of inequality. How we mitigate these will be the ultimate determinant of whether as nations we have successfully served or failed humanity. According to a report compiled by McKinsey Global Institute, almost 6.7 million South African workers could be affected by the changes brought about by automation and new digital technologies. It is therefore a race against time to bring about the right combination of policies and practices to avert unprecedented levels of unemployment with the concomitant negative social and economic effects. I wish to assert that technology must be driven to complement workers and not replace them. Governments must pursue policies that encourage increased access to digital tools, make digital and internet access cheaper, and electronic transactions easy. Once again, let me take this opportunity to express our profound gratitude to the Institute of Development Studies and its partners for the honor bestowed upon us to share these thoughts with you all, and as a form of encouragement. Whilst we deliberate on innovative ways to address the changes occurring, I would like to close with a quote from the iconic Nelson Mandela adult book, who says, "It always seems impossible until it is done." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister, and I think that was a very appropriate quote to end with. So I now turn to our final opening speaker, Professor Maggie Bowden from the University of Sussex. So Maggie, over to you. Thank you.
Well, morning everybody. We've had 3 hugely stimulating talks there, each of which gives us reason to be hugely excited, but also very apprehensive about the future, whether we're talking about the developed world or the developing world. And it's clear that there are huge economic imperatives here leading to these changes in employment, both the number and the nature of jobs across the world. And the stakes, as I think it was Anne who said, could hardly be higher. So if you want to look for reasons for pessimism, there are plenty there. But I think that there has also been 3 examples, well, more than 3 examples, but 3 people offering us reasons for optimism. Each one of the 3 talks that you heard was stressing not just the economic imperatives, both the opportunities and dangers, but the human dimension. And that's hugely, hugely important. And I was very, very pleased to hear each one of those 3 speakers putting that at the forefront of what they were saying. And it's certainly at the forefront of what I want to say. First of all, a sort of obvious point in a way, and it's already actually been mentioned this morning. If possible, if the policymakers, and for that matter the technologists who are writing the systems that are going to be used here, can enable jobs to, enable human beings to be complemented in their work practices by technology rather than replaced by it. And one reason for that is sort of obvious, well, it gives them decent jobs and a purpose and a way of earning a living and so on and so forth. That's obvious. It also, however, keeps the human dimension clear and relevant and important and valued. And, there are many, many jobs which involve a human dimension. In some cases, that can be forgotten. For instance, take legal examples. People often say, well, lawyers are already using AI systems to help them because they're dealing with rules and regulations much of the time, and rules and regulations are just the sorts of things which AI systems can be enabled to cope with just as well, if not better, and more cheaply than human beings. So that's fine. So AI systems in the law are fine. Well, suppose that you're going to a solicitor to draw up a will. Very, very simple example. You go to a solicitor to draw up a will, and he knows the laws in your country concerning wills and inheritance and so forth, and so he will tell you that. So you might say that could all be put into an AI system. Well, so it could, the legal things could. But hopefully, if you go to a solicitor to talk about a will, he will at some point say to you, if it's relevant, perhaps you should think twice about leaving all that money to your rather tearaway grandson. Perhaps if you leave that money to him, you might want to say, he shouldn't get it till he's 25, for example. Or other issues about equality and fairness to members of the family and who's going to feel left out. I don't mean financially left out only, but emotionally left out by the terms of your will. I mean, these are things which a human solicitor will quite naturally raise, and I think they're very important. I think in something like a will, which is something that is going to come into force obviously only when you are dead, and you are going to be largely remembered by it, by many members of your family, the ones who are affected, you don't want that to go wrong. So that's just one example. If you just go to a will-making app, it's not going to ask you all those questions. Second example, people very often say, and of course quite rightly, that there are many, and increasingly many, diseases where an AI application is by far the best approach to give a diagnosis. Certain sorts of cancer, for example, the cells involved, the cancerous cells, can be recognised far better by a particular sort of very specialised computer vision system than by the best human histologists. That's perfectly true. So you know, because of this AI thingy, that you have got this type of cancer, and you know what the statistics are in terms of longevity and side effects of drugs that you might use, and so on, so on, so on. But you might well want to talk about the quality of life with your doctor. You might well want to discuss with a human being who is not only an expert, a medical expert, but is a human being, about do you want to have an extra, 1 year of life if this is the cost, and I don't mean financial cost, if this is the experiential cost. That's not something that can be discussed with any sort of computer system. Of course you can discuss it with your family, but your family are not medical experts. So that's another obvious example. And another example, and I very much agree actually here with the minister, who said that one of the many interesting things he said was that there are certain jobs that are virtually impossible to automate. And one example that you mentioned, Minister, was carers, human carers. I think that's absolutely right. But nonetheless, there are huge sums of money being spent on research and now on production of so-called computer carers, computer companions. Now, I think the words carer and companion here, they're hugely dangerous, deceptive, weasel words. I think there can be no such thing as a computer carer, as a computer companion. Of course there can be computer aids which can help people in doing things which at the moment can only be done for them by human carers. So, for example, you could certainly have a little robot thing that would chumper about the house and go to the fridge and, make you a cup of tea or whatever. I have no problems with that whatsoever. The things that worry me much more are the natural language using systems, which are supposed, according to their sellers and advertisers, and I'm afraid the researchers who are working on them in these cases, who are supposed to offer you comfort, conversation, even the word conviviality I've seen used in this context. And the notion is, that you're a very, very lonely person, maybe you have no living relatives, or if you do, they don't visit you, and the people who are supposed to be caring for you, employed to be caring for you, are so stressed, so busy, that you can't give you very much of their time at all. And the story you're told by these people, these, I would say, technocrats really, is that you can get that sort of human contact from one of their natural language using systems. Well, I'm sorry, you can't. And there are two reasons why you can't. I mean, the first is it's just far too difficult. The natural language processing is far too difficult. We're nowhere near there. In my opinion, we never will be. We're absolutely nowhere near there. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, even if it looked as though we weren't near there, even if there were a system which could use language to have conversations with you and enable you, for example, to tell your favourite stories about your favourite memories from when you were 18 years old, over and over again, because the thing isn't going to get bored. Right? You're not having a conversation, and suppose you tell it about a sad memory. What's it going to say? I mean, it could certainly pick up that you were upset, so it might say, oh, I'm very sorry, or I'm sorry you're upset. What does that mean? It means absolutely nothing at all. There is not only no human empathy there, there is no human experience there. The thing, and I say thing advisedly, the thing doesn't share the human condition. And that's a fundamental basis for all sorts of things in caring. Even something as simple as my putting my hand on Melissa's shoulder. If I had been a robot and put my hand on her shoulder, that would... But if I know you were upset and I put my hand on your shoulder, it helps a tiny bit, but it helps because I'm another human being and I understand. So what I hope would happen, and certainly in an ideal world this would happen, that as these changes, and they're inevitable, as these changes, as they arrive, they've already arrived, of course, but as they accelerate, that people would take on board what the Minister said, what the other two speakers have said, about always putting people and the experience of people in the forefront, and not just the people who are doing or losing or changing the jobs, but people who are using those people, benefiting from those people, to get their wills drafted, to get a sandwich made, to listen to a story about their early life. And so if policymakers can keep people absolutely at the forefront, not economics at the forefront, but of course economics is hugely important here, but keep people in the forefront all the time is absolutely crucial. And I was very heartened by the fact that that seemed to be clear in all of the three talks we've had so far.
Maggie, I can't thank you enough for another fantastic opening talk, which, as you say, has taken us well beyond economics into the realm of people, but also ethics, values, morality, a whole set of other concepts and ideas, as well as examples that I think we can take forward into the rest of the day. So we've had a foundation perspective, a policymaker perspective, a research perspective, which I think has set us up really well for the day ahead. So I'm now going to hand over to Ben Ramalingam, who heads the Digital and Technology Research Group at IDS, who's going to take us through how the day will work and also introduce the next session. So please join me once more in thanking our opening speakers.
Thank you very much, Melissa, Deputy Minister, Maggie. This is the culmination of almost a year's worth of thinking, engagement and development by IDS, by Web Foundation and by Nesta and our supporting partners. And I think I just want to say at the outset, I'm really excited, and on behalf of the whole organising committee, we're really excited about that day ahead. We've tried to design the whole day to enable us to really collectively reflect on the range of impacts that the ongoing digital revolution will have on the future of work. And we want to think through together the kinds of things we might do to ensure we amplify positive digital dividends, whilst minimising or mitigating digital bads. And what we're doing today builds on our collective effort and digital foresight, in which we're trying to explore the future impact of digital technology on a whole range of issues, including employment, health and citizenship. We're not doing this, by the way, and I think I speak for the consortium as a whole here, we're not doing this pretending to have the answers, and I think anyone that says they have the answer to this question is probably selling me something they shouldn't be. Rather, we think we have some of the tools, some of the questions, and some of the ways of thinking through this set of issues in a way that's systematic, that's creative, that's collaborative, and that's goal-oriented. And with that in mind, I want to quickly walk you through the agenda and explain what we'll be doing. So, in just a few moments, I'll share some opening remarks, and we'll be hearing from our keynote speakers, Professors Mark Graham and Gina Porter, on what we know about how digital technologies are affecting jobs right now across a whole range of developing countries. And this is going to give us a really grounded perspective on people's lives and people's livelihoods, just to reiterate the points that were made by our opening speakers. Following the discussion, following the keynote address and discussion, we'll be stopping for a 30-minute break, and we'll have tea and coffee up in the area just up the stairs. We've also got a fantastic installation for you. For those of you who want to know what it's like to actually do a digital gig economy job, the work we want is installation, which is in the room just behind us. It can take up to 15 people at a time, developed by Tom Berman of Glass House Productions. And it's based on research, videos, and an interactive experience that will help you learn about the future of work firsthand. And just as a hint, you get paid peanuts. We've also got a fantastic publications table where you've got a whole selection of materials both related to the topic and from the broader organising team. So after that coffee, we'll be coming back in, and here we'll have the first of our participatory dialogue sessions. And we in IDF, together with colleagues actually in the Amidia group back in September, spent a bit of time developing a session where we tried to bring together personas from design thinking with futures work. And we're calling this session persona-based scenarios. And we want you to think together about the challenges and needs facing diverse groups of workers in developing countries, some of whom we've heard about already, and what we might do about these needs and these opportunities. Then over lunch, Tom will be running the Work We Want installation again, and after lunch we'll be using another large group participatory session where we'll be using the World Cafe to think about different actors and what their priorities might be and what recommendations we might develop for how we can ensure decent work for all. And then finally we'll be closing off with a great panel of speakers chaired by Anne Jalmer of the Web Foundation. We'll have Anna Bayevskaya of OECD TUAC, Mamadou Bataille of Rockefeller Foundation, Duncan Green of Oxfam, and Kojo Boyaki of Facebook. And we'll wrap up the day just before 5 o'clock, and we'll have a bar open just there, and you're all welcome to join us for networking and drinks. Now, in doing all of this, in working through this agenda, we do want to make sure we stick to some ground rules. And we want to make sure that today's participatory, that we focus on mutual learning, but there are a lot of different perspectives, and this is an emotive topic, and it raises lots of different challenges. And I think one of the key ground rules is that we want to be respectful of diversity, both of roles and of perspectives. And we want to make sure we focus our energies on the collective challenge that we face, and make sure we really work together in a spirit of openness and honesty, and also make sure that our dialogue is relaxed and informal and fun. So a few practicalities. In terms of housekeeping, you know where the teas and coffees are. Lunch will be served up there. The bathrooms are just along from the stairs. There are no scheduled fire alarms, so if there is a sound from the fire alarms, it is because there is a fire. The visitor experience host will undertake the evacuation, and there's a muster point from the Queen's Walk at the flag post. Final thing on practicalities, we do have a feedback form in the packs, and I'll remind you this later, but please do fill these out and hand them back to us at the registration desk by the end of the day. So that's it in terms of practicalities. You've had a lot of talking, and there's going to be a little bit more talking. So what I actually want to do before we actually get into the keynotes is to give you the opportunity to turn to your neighbour and to buzz for a few minutes on what you think the impact of technology will be in jobs in the next 10 to 15 years. And I just want to give you a couple of minutes just to buzz with whoever your neighbour might be, and then we'll have a few selective responses, and then we'll go into the keynote session. Okay? Do we have the mic somewhere? Can I have a few responses from the floor? What do we think? I just want to get 4 or 5 suggestions. Who'd pass the mic round? Who'd like to share a couple of thoughts or two? Any volunteers?
Someone can hand one down.
Oh, someone over there? Oh.
To pick up. Yeah, hi, morning everybody. Just in a moment. I see personally sort of massive upside, ubiquitous internet access and new opportunities for education, global outsourcing, things that weren't possible, sort of turning the world into one larger economy and the erosion of frontiers in organisations and countries because we're all working together.
Very good, very positive. Do we have any alternatives? Or agreement with that?
Yeah, thank you. I think we agree. And also I think we can't emphasize the importance of looking at the human aspect of the changes. And I think what's very important, like my colleagues were discussing during the bus session, is to actually find out those people that are actually building the artificial intelligence systems, are they conscious about the human side of it? Or do they simply build it because it's the right thing to do? Or it gives them, they showed the technology prowess by simply building these systems to replace humans. So it will be very interesting to see the designers of the AI systems and what kind of personalities do they have. Are they human? Or are they just technology driven or just robotic focused? Thank you.
Thank you. So our AI program is human. That's a good one. Thank you.
Hi, this is Eleanor Harrison from Global Giving. We very much think that there will be pluses and minuses. It will be very different depending on the sector, but we think that you'll see some very well paid, highly skilled people in different markets. You'll probably see a pressure upwards and a pressure downwards, so there'll be less middle of the road jobs. And in something like education, you will need an absolute radical revolution in teacher training to rapidly upskill the teachers and change the way that they teach young people in the classroom and beyond. But we're really concerned about management and leadership. How are you going to be able to manage your chief technology officers? Thinking about the AI and how they're working in the bias. And we think the risk will be, if we don't quickly upskill and diversify your coders, then the risk, I think, is that you could end up with a redomination of kind of like the white Western man. Sorry, for the ladies in the room.
Couple more. Just about that.
Seb Martin from DFID. I was just a thought about the timescale where you say 10 to 15 years, and the thought that potentially in 15 years, depending on the progress of Moore's law, we could have a 1,000-fold decrease in computing power, and if that actually happens, then that will have a massive impact. There's no two ways about it.
Thank you. Any other comments? What about from this side of the room? Anything provocative or interesting you care to share? Oh.
Hi, Emma Shoemaker with Cadbury Digital. We talked a little bit about how the push towards entrepreneurialism forces us to be, or forces people working in that space, to be, develop the self as a brand, to push oneself as being, having their own website, having their own front, always selling yourself as a product. And that in the gig economy, that's forced more and more as people's reputational scores, etc., are pushing people to always make sure that they are presenting themselves in the best possible way. And the demands that makes on people's knowledge of the systems they work with, the control over what other people know about you in order to measure and control what your reputation is to participate in these new gig economies, are going to put huge demands on people's knowledge and capabilities of the systems that they're taking part in. So there's a huge question of both access, capabilities, knowledge that will create that arguably could create stronger divides between people who have access, people who have skills, people who have knowledge and don't.
Definitely, I think a really interesting point there is individuals as well. I think Mark will show you a little bit later on how these platforms are very good at supporting individuals. They certainly can't support businesses or firms, so I think that's a really interesting point. We'll take one last point here, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I'm Andy Bates from Tolt Ventures, and in our group we were talking about that in the future we could see that with the availability of a lot more data, is that we could see new services, and in particular what you're talking about, individual services starting to be delivered and things that really we never thought we knew that we needed. And also the more human element part of that, we could see that the mundane could well disappear as far as the repetitive tasks go, but much more human element of that coming in. And one of the examples I can give is that we're working with a healthcare insurer at the moment, and when people phone up, is that yes, you've got junior people having to deal with very complex issues there, and AI has definitely helped that. And what it's done is it's allowed those people to do the more human part of it, and the stuff that we were talking about earlier around empathising and empathy and things that machines can't do as well as humans can.
Thank you very much. That's a really useful set of inputs. Let's make sure we kind of carry on building on those course of our dialogue over the course of the day. Actually, before I carry on, one thing I did want to say was just to send apologies from Jeff Mulgan, who unfortunately couldn't be here because of family illnesses, so I'm standing in for him. In that spirit, I'm going to share some initial remarks just to kick off the keynote session, and really to give you a perspective of how we're seeing it from the Institute of Development Studies and at the Digital and Technology Cluster. And we're trying to take a long view on these issues of digital technology and how they can contribute to development. So that means taking a historical view, it means trying to take an anticipatory view, and also trying to be really grounded, as Melissa said, in people's lives and livelihoods. And I'm going to set out just a few thoughts and reflections along these lines now. So what I want to begin with is to talk about history. History can actually be a really useful guide to the future. And we know that there have been a number of big technological impacts on jobs in recent history. From 1750 to 1830, impacting 18th century farmers through the creation of the steam engine, mechanical production, railroads and cotton spinning, a whole number of different machines which replaced dirty and dangerous labour and created a whole host of new jobs. From 1870 to 1900, with the introduction of electricity, the internal combustion engine, indoor plumbing, division of labour, organisational principles like mass production, machines replaced dull and repetitive work, at a cost, of course. And then that kind of continued over time, and the next really big technological change we saw was the introduction of the digital revolution. And this is the IDS digital technology team relaxing. Where the digital technology, the early stages of computers were slowly incorporated into office work. What's really telling here is the fact that the people outnumber the machines. Compare this to the 2000s, where the first decade and a half of the 21st century has seen a step change in the digital revolution to what some call hyper-digitalization, powered by ICTs, powered by the internet, whereby machines are not just doing basic work, not just replacing manual work, but replacing a whole set of work roles and functions related to decision making. And this is related to the rise of a whole series of technologies which are interlinked increasingly. So we've talked about artificial intelligence, but there's also mobile ubiquity, datafication, robotics, 3D printing, the Internet of Things, virtual and augmented realities, and a whole host of network technologies. Now, each one of these macro effects have caused big shocks amongst governments, amongst civil society, amongst businesses, and amongst workers. And there are some really broad lessons to be learned here. Now, there's a really nice quote from the former IMF chief economist, Ken Rogoff, and he says, "Since the dawn of the industrial age, a recurrent fear has been that technological change will spawn mass employment. Neoclassical economists predicted this would not happen because people would find other jobs, albeit possibly after long periods of painful adjustment. By and large, that prediction has proven to be correct." I guess albeit possibly and by and large are the words I'd focus on in this quote. Technological change nowadays has accelerated, potentially leading to deeper and more profound dislocations. Technological change is not all upside, and transitions can be painful. This time, the change can be different, and one should be careful in extrapolating the experience of the last 2 centuries to the next 2. And we as humankind will be confronted with much more complex economic and moral questions as technology accelerates. So I think in relation to the point that Seb raised earlier, yes, Moore's laws absolutely could have that doubling, quadrupling, non-linear effect, but the questions that then poses to us, I think, are really, we don't even know what those questions are. As well as looking back, I think we need to look forward. We need to think about some of the widely anticipated trends that we're building here on work done by the World Economic Forum, by Gartner, by the Pew Internet Centre and others. So what are some of these trends? What does the future actually look like in practice? So one of the first things that we can say is that apparently over the next few years, 50% of the fastest growing machines will have fewer employees than smart machines. Manufacturing in particular is likely to be disrupted by the rise of a whole range of technologies, including 3D printing. And this is important for developing countries because low-cost production in developing countries is going to be less attractive than so-called reshoring to machines domestically. So companies will be incentivized to bring manufacturing back to their home countries. And more generally, it's anticipated that next year a number of businesses will be launched that are not just staffed by algorithms, but entirely conceived and developed by algorithms. More than 3 million workers by 2020 will be globally supervised by a robo-boss. So imagine, if you will, being managed by a heartless, soulless creature who cares nothing about your personal happiness, driven only by efficiency and... Why are you laughing? So Mark's going to give us some really excellent examples of this. In Amazon's Mechanical Turk, there's an internet marketplace, which many of you will know, where people called Turkers offer their services, and much of the people coordination is done by algorithm. The Mechanical Turk lists available tasks, and it lists everything from drawing a logo to transcribing audio recordings to writing news stories. And based on past performance, an algorithm will then place them higher or lower on the potential candidates for a job. Now, while these tasks are not particularly autonomous by the standards of a human being, they do perform the bare bones of a task of an employee, task allocation, evaluation, and payment. And what's important is most of those 3 million workers overseen by robots and algorithms are likely to be in developing countries. Autonomous software agents outside human control will participate in 5% of all economic transactions. Now, this may seem like a really abstract point, but rapid computer trading based on artificial intelligence is now fully 40% of India's stock market volumes. In just 5 years, high-speed algorithmic trading has gone from bit players to a dominant force on India's exchanges. And there's a technological arms race between the nation's top exchanges to try and cut transaction times with tiny fractions of a second because there are billions to be made. And now some of the country's largest brokerages are calling for tighter regulation. And those same bosses are now starting to explore whether or not these speed traders should be reined in. 6 billion connected things by 2020 will be requesting support directly without human mediation, and a good proportion of them will be getting it in the same way. The best example of this from our ongoing work is the work we've been doing on frontier technologies, where we've been examining smart mobile energy systems, which are prevalent in East Africa now and actually growing all around the world. Mobile phone payments are really useful because they can enable poor people to lease solar equipment at much lower cost than kerosene supplies. Much more energy efficient, it's healthier. But if they don't keep those payments up, then those same mobile systems are used to just automatically turn the system off. And those kinds of decisions are going to have put people who were previously reliant on these energy systems completely energy dependent. And algorithms are going to be making those kinds of choices about millions of lives across developed and developing countries alike. Apparently, in the next few years, 20% of all business content will be authored by machines. AP already has an automated system trained in the AP style that automatically writes and publishes 3,000 stories every quarter, and that number is growing. We already live in a world where 90% of content online is produced by people in developing countries. So I wonder how long it's going to be before there is more machine content online than there is developing country content online. Does this matter? How much does it matter? Who does it matter to? And of course there's a ubiquitous point about self-driving vehicles. So 10 million self-driving vehicles will be on the road by 2020. I guess what's really important is that this relationship, Gartner says that the relationship between people and machines are moving from cooperative to codependent to competitive. I'm not sure I fully agree. I think that we're kind of somewhere in between. There are some which are competitive, some which are codependent, and some which are competitive. And we're not really sure which is going to be the way forward. And I think perhaps the single most important lesson is that the impacts on employment, the impacts on jobs are not going to be uniform. It's not going to be the positive story that we heard from one of our respondents. It's not going to be the doom-laden story. There's going to be all kinds of potential from digital technologies that they can replicate ideas and processes and innovations at very low cost. And it creates abundance for society and it creates wealth for innovators, but it increasingly diminishes the demand for some kinds of labour and skills. And even the most optimistic of digital scholars, Eric Baum-Jolson and Andrew McAfee at MIT, they argue while there's never been a better time to be a worker with specialist skills and a right education, there's never been a worse time to be an ordinary worker with ordinary skills and ordinary abilities. And just to reiterate the point that Melissa made that was from a background paper, this summarises cross-country analysis by the World Bank that suggests that up to 2/3 of the jobs in the developing world are under threat from automation. And some people actually assume that weak levels of development may be a buffer because low wages mean that it's not economical to replace them with technologies. But actually this isn't the case in many low and middle-income countries. What's happening is that the full impact of automation is likely to take longer to reach developing countries, but it's going to be more disruptive because of the lack of consumer demand for diversity of products and the limited social safety nets. And so in development work, we've got a whole set of sustainable development goals that you might know of. And one of them, Goal 8, looks at promoting sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth and full employment and decent work for all. And there's a number of areas where digital technologies should be considered, things like technological upgrading, innovation, and so on. But what's really striking about this goal is there's no explicit mention of digital technologies anywhere in this goal or in any of the indicators. It doesn't actually seem to consider any of the things we actually know about the impact of technology for the past. Technology is only seen as an enabler. And I don't think we can possibly hit any of these targets without full consideration of the impact of digital. And at the very least, we need to be really aware of the impacts that digital technology can have on whole sections of works in developing countries. And I think this is where I want to really highlight the work of the ESRC DFID Impact Initiative. So there's been a whole range of research that's been done, and that really highlights the fact that we need to understand people's lives. The people aspect is really important. And we need to do that by really digging into their lives and taking a whole range of different methods to explore the ways in which technologies right now are impacting and enabling and empowering, but also disempowering and creating inequalities and creating challenges. And with that in mind, I want to hand over now to Mark Graham, who's going to give us our first keynote. Mark Graham of the Oxford Institute, looking at the role of digital technologies and digital jobs. And Mark's actually got a new report out, which is also available just on the publications table. So thank you very much, everyone. Let me hand over to Mark.
Okay, thanks Ben, and thanks Becky and the IDS for inviting me and having me here today, and for putting this day of conversation together. So, I'm going to talk about some of the things that my colleagues and I have learned from studying digital work at some of the world's economic margins, and specifically some of the key problems that are associated with the bringing into being of a global market for work. I started thinking about these issues a few years ago when leading an ESRC DFID-funded project on business process outsourcing in East Africa, and that evolved into the current research that I'm carrying out with some of my colleagues. I'll just mention them: Alex Wood, Vili Ledum-Vita, Isis Fjorth, and Emir Anwar at Oxford, and our colleague Helena Barnard at Gibbs in Johannesburg. We've spent the last few years studying this topic. We're far from done. As Ben mentioned, we do have this preliminary report on the topic over on the table there, if any of you are interested in it. We've done interviews with 152 workers in Nigeria, in Kenya, in South Africa, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, and in Vietnam. We've done a survey with over 500 more in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we've analyzed 6 months of transaction data from one of the world's largest online work platforms. How do I get my slides up? There we go. Thanks. So, the issue that I'm talking about here, it comes at the confluence of 4 different stories. So first, the idea that the world's increasingly defined by labor surplus. So every single year, 46 million workers join the world's labor force, the vast majority of whom live in low and middle income countries, and many of whom will struggle to find employment in their local labor market. The second story is the one we've already heard about, changing connectivity. We have about 3.5 billion people connected. Now, at some point this year, over half of humanity will be connected. The third story is about all of the invisible labor that's increasingly needed to grease the wheels of our contemporary economy. So it can sometimes look like magic that something like an autocomplete bar works properly, or that driverless cars can distinguish people from trees, or that videos can be captioned, or languages can be translated. So in other words, there are a lot of digital tasks that need to be done by real people. The digital world relies still on a lot of real digital labor. And the fourth story is the evolution of an older story of outsourcing. So the move from large organizations outsourcing to large organizations, to something a bit different. All of these platforms and work marketplaces that have been constructed to allow people to relatively easily buy and sell labor. There are apparently 48 million workers globally now registered with online labor platforms doing work that, according to the World Bank, consisted of $5 billion worth of transactions last year. Now, just very quickly, what sorts of things are these people doing? Well, some of it is doing things like playing games to create items of value and then selling those items. So if any of you are familiar with Pokemon, here's a Pokemon account that you could buy on the player auctions website. This was someone's job to upskill this thing. It can be even more niche platforms that connect workers to clients in order to do things like pages on Facebook or YouTube or Instagram, or retweet things on Twitter. Some of it enters into a black market for services that many would find unethical. So, for instance, the essay writing industry, which seems to be particularly large. If you go to this website, you can actually get someone to write a PhD dissertation for you. Don't do that. But I actually met workers in Nairobi who did this for a living. It can be so-called human intelligence tasks on a platform like Mechanical Turk. So if you've been following the Donald Trump fake news saga, here's an actual job listing for someone to write a fake news article for a right-wing website on the subject, and this was a real job. The subject was First Lesbian Bishop Boots Out Christ and Welcomes Muhammad. Here's the this was actually done by someone. But most of the work instead looks a bit like this. This is a bit more boring. This is Upwork.com. On this platform, clients list a whole range of jobs, things like web development, content writing, graphic design, and then workers bid on those tasks. Now, because of the confluence of these 4 factors that I mentioned, unemployment, changing connectivity, the demand for a whole range of digital tasks, and the availability of all of this work, there are a lot of people who are talking about the potential of this sort of digital labor to positively change the lives of people in low-income countries. Let me give you a few examples of that. So, for instance, in the Philippines, the executive director of the Philippine government's ICT office organized dozens of roadshows in which they were encouraging people to sign up to online work platforms. These things were run all over the Philippines. Tens of thousands of people attended them. Nigeria's government has a similar program called Micro Work for Jobs Creation. Kenya's government is starting something similar. This picture is an example of a training program in Nairobi where workers are taught how to transcribe short snippets of text. The thing they're transcribing, incidentally, is what's written on the bottom of the screen there from a Steve Jobs video that they're working on. What unites all of these things is that a vision that not only new types of jobs are available, but essentially new economic geographies exist. So the global market for this digital work is, as the CEO of one of the world's largest marketplaces told us, frictionless. Now, what I want to do is contrast this sort of vision of cloud labor with what we actually see happening. And to do that, I want to start by talking about its actual geographies. So if we look at data from September 2016 from an index of the world's largest platforms that's put together by some of my colleagues, we see a quite noteworthy geography of supply and demand. So almost all of the demand for this digital work comes from a handful of countries in the global north, plus India. But if I were to show you a map of where the workers are from, you'd see it's from all over the place. So rich and poor countries all competing in the same market. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that demand is geographically concentrated, but supply is geographically diffuse. It's also worth mentioning that there seems to be an imbalance in the quantity of the supply and demand of this work. So this is from Upwork.com. The platform has almost 2 million active workers, but less than 100,000 active jobs. So what we did on this chart here was we compared the potential workforce, so in other words, the number of profiles, to successful workers, so people who worked at least 1 hour or billed at least $1. So if you look at a country like the Philippines, which is the second row on this chart, you can see that there are 221,000 people registered, so 221,000 people who in theory are looking for a job, but only 32,000 who manage to find any work at all. So 189,000 people who can't find any work on the platform just in the Philippines. Now, knowing that, let me talk about some of the concerns. I'm just going to focus on concerns here, some of the concerns that we found, and I'll talk about 4 of them. Most significant is the bargaining power of workers. Many have very little because of what I've already spoken about, and let me give you a few more examples of how this lack of bargaining power is manifested. Many workers align their work hours to be in sync with Western Europe and North America, and this means a lot of them suffer from exhaustion. 57% of the workers in our survey told us they lose sleep as a result of doing this work. Only 23% said they didn't lose sleep. Workers also tend to have quite stringent conditions imposed on them. So for instance, on Upwork, screenshots are taken of your screen every 10 minutes to make sure that workers are doing what you say. If you happen to be on Facebook or something during that 10-minute block, then you're not paid for that. And because of some of these geographical imbalances that I mentioned, there were plenty of examples of online workers who felt quite powerless to negotiate conditions and rates for their labor. So they quite vividly experienced a perceived oversupply of labor power on these platforms, knowing that there are other workers all over the world that can do their job, and so they can't charge what they feel are fair rates. A lot of workers told us stories like this one. They were disheartened by the scope and the scale of competition surrounding them. In our survey, 45% of workers told us they felt they were easily replaceable. Only 26% disagreed with that statement. And this is important because most of the people that we spoke to had very limited social security, so this presents both a risk to their health and their income if they're to lose work. Another thing that we looked at in our data is the question of whether online work is reconfiguring service, trade, value chain. So there's this idea that digital work would allow for more geographic bridging and disintermediation, essentially allowing workers to connect directly to clients. Now, the issue is that this doesn't take into account the heavy role that reputational capital plays on these platforms. So work platforms, they don't try to offer an architecture for generating trust on the basis of thick, strong, stable, durable ties that could essentially restrict the commodification of labor here. Instead, you get these 1 to 5 star rating systems. So if you have a good feedback score as a worker, you'll get a lot of work. But we spoke to loads of workers who said it took them months or even years to find their first job because they didn't have any positive feedback to start with. So work essentially goes to those with a good feedback score. And because of that, we saw a fair amount of this going on. Some of those with the best scores, they get work, and then they hire other workers on the platform to carry out work for them, often under quite unfavorable conditions. Let me give you an example of that. So we spoke to one worker, for instance, who applied for this job in the middle of the screen there, called Write an Article About Tailor-Made Suits. This is probably for search engine optimization reasons. But the job went to another contractor, not the person we spoke to. The one who got it had a very high positive feedback score and requested a price of $23. The contractor then offered the job to the person that we spoke to for just $3.50. And she took it. And she took it because she needed work, but not without feeling the whole situation was inherently unfair. So all of this happening requires that labor be as easy to buy and sell as something like a mobile phone charger or a book. And that probably helps to contribute to the significant income inequality that we see on these platforms. So this is a graph made by my colleague Vili Leidenbrita that shows with some of the data, the transaction data that we got from one of the platforms, about 80% of the workers make only about 10% of the income. The third thing I want to talk about is skills upgrading. So in some cases we saw functional upgrading and a movement towards higher value work, but most workers were essentially kept at an arm's length. Many workers just didn't know who they were working for or what purpose or function their labor ultimately serves. And this made it quite hard for them to upgrade. And remember, people are spending a huge amount of time doing work for labor. Our survey respondents spent an average of 18 hours every week browsing, applying, and reading about jobs. And so this makes it hard to build deep relationships into specific production networks. And finally, economic inclusion. So we heard cases of workers transcending local labor market discrimination, but there were equally examples of exclusion being explicitly, almost subtly expressed. This is one of the more obvious ones here, where the client tells workers from South Asia to not even bother bidding on a task. So to wrap this up, it's worth explicitly saying, this is from one of the promotional things in the Philippines I was talking about. So I think it's worth explicitly saying that these online work platforms, they've undoubtedly helped a lot of people find work and income and autonomy and flexibility that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But there are also important problems. We see a sort of parasitic capitalism in which work is bought and sold as a commodity. Through a pretense of being disembedded, these digital firms often give very little back to the places that they actually are embedded in. For instance, the payment of taxes. And remember, almost none of these guys are paying taxes, but they still make use of the institutional and the resource investments of others in those places. I don't want to end just there, though. So instead, what I want to end with are some reflections on what some alternate futures for what digital work might actually look like. And I want to end with 4 ideas. So first of all, there we go. So first of all, political economy strategy. So I think there are many reasons to be optimistic about the potentials of what people are calling platform cooperatives. So organizations or platforms that seek to give workers more control or ownership of the digital means of production. So instead of platforms extracting rents from every transaction, collectives of workers can think about ways to capture those rents. What I worry, though, is that they only have a limited ability to rebalance some of the weak bargaining power of the kinds of digital workers that we've been speaking about. In contexts where we're talking about something like platforms for taxis or for short-term accommodation, there's a sort of inherent stickiness to that work. So an Uber driver in Nairobi has no way of taking work away from an Uber driver in New York and vice versa. So cooperative might have some potential here. But that isn't the case with a lot of work that gets done in the platforms that we've been speaking about. So workers can and workers do easily undercut each other because of the global nature of it, because of the way that work is partially disembedded. A potentially global market for work will likely lead to more competition than collaboration. So not that there's no hope for these sorts of cooperatives in this domain, but I think we need some additional strategies to augment them. So second, market-based strategies. I think as a complementary approach, we could imagine a market-based approach in which strategies of consumer watchdogs, certification schemes, and activist organizations could be emulated. A lot of this sort of exploitative digital work that probably happens because end users don't really know much about upstream work practices. So we could imagine organizations committed to transparency and identifying best practices doing a lot to ensure that workers are paid living wages, have appropriate social and economic protections, and aren't saddled with an undue amount of risk. So essentially a fair work foundation instead of a fair trade foundation, verifying and certifying these sorts of things. And I actually have a more detailed white paper published about what a fair work foundation would look like in case anyone wants to talk more or collaborate on this. We can also use what we know about the socially disembedded nature of this work to push for more of it to be sourced through firms, social enterprises, non-profits, and of course cooperatives of the non-platform variety that actually adhere to local labor laws. There are organizations out there that fit this more socially responsible mold. Think of Digital Divide Data or Samasource as examples, but the problem is that they can struggle to compete with the low cost base of these online platforms. Third, regulatory strategies. So the geographically dispersed nature of digital work platforms has made it extremely hard to regulate. There are many who thrive in that environment, but the role of labor regulation should actually be to help the most vulnerable. So we get situations like this one on the screen here, where the platform boasts that contracts can be ended at any time. So my colleague Alex Wood and I took some advice from employment lawyers in the UK, and they told us that at least in the UK, employment status needs to be established in the place that the service is actually provided. And this brings us back to geography. Where is a service provided? If a work is in one country, a client's in another country, and the computer server on which the work is being done is in a third country. I think whatever the answer is, let's remember that only a few countries are home to the majority of clients. Let's think about these handful of countries as essentially strategic bottlenecks in the system. So my understanding is that German unions are already proposing some form of this, whereby the end client in any supply chain is responsible that a minimum wage is paid throughout it. And I think it's in those strategic bottlenecks, the few countries that source the lion's share of work, that we can think about enforcing minimum standards. So why should an employer based in Germany or the US or the UK be able to avoid adhering to local labor laws and minimum standards just because they used a digital platform to connect with a worker? And if we can start by ensuring that all of this work is at a minimum under the jurisdiction of regulation that happens somewhere, then we can look to solutions and best practices. So in the UK, for instance, under pressure from the GMB union, the courts have begun ruling that Uber drivers and various courier drivers, they can't be classified as self-employed workers anymore. So that means they're potentially entitled to the rights of employees rather than freelancers. Okay, and finally, labor rights strategies. So traditional unions relied on proximity to build a sense of mutuality amongst workers. Place mattered to them. A seeming paradox of our digital age is that by connecting people and reducing distance, they also seem to be reducing shared empathy amongst workers. There's an understanding amongst workers that if they withdraw their labor, then workers in other parts of the world are able to quickly replace them. What could be done then? I think it's important to remember that many workers aren't totally atomized. When recently Upwork doubled their fees for many workers, almost 900 workers from around the world complained on Upwork's forum. This is a map put together by some of my colleagues which shows where all those workers who complained came from. One thing that shows me is that we need transnational responses to these sorts of issues. So with a transnational digital workers union, if we lack the physical proximity that unions traditionally needed, we at least need some sort of shared occupational identity. Now, the issue is that there are competing worker identities at play. Some see themselves as doing digital work that's just temporary, some see it as a springboard for their larger career, some see it as full-time work, some as part-time work, some see themselves as entrepreneurs, some as workers. So one explicit role for a digital workers union could be building a sort of class consciousness here amongst these varied workers, highlighting the precariousness of this work and highlighting that workers are receiving a lot of the risks of entrepreneurship, but few of the rewards. A second strategy could be to remember that the dispersed geographies of workers doesn't always need to be used against them. So firms and platforms are actually still based somewhere. And knowing the geography of both the workers and the firms, you can imagine strategies like taking action at the headquarters of a platform. And finally, a third strategy has been what you might think of as bringing into being digital spaces of resistance. So perhaps strategically re-envisioning the digital as a space. Digital workers already make extensive use of digital affordances like Facebook groups and subreddits in order to coordinate and share complaints, share work opportunities, and give feedback to one another. And this bringing into being, this bringing together of digital workers opens up creative potentials for what you might think of as digital picket lines that could barricade the digital presences of firms in order to have the sort of disruptive effects that physical picket lines have. And specifically, this could mean using practices like Google bombing, Google washing, hashtag activism. Basically, if a digital firm is its digital presence, there are ways for coalitions of workers to occupy some of those digital presences. So to end this, to sum up, at the moment, the millions of workers who do this sort of digital work, they do so in a largely unregulated and socially disembedded way. This clearly benefits some workers, but I think we should also worry about a race to the bottom, especially if tens of millions of new internet users join the global network every year. I'm not saying any of this to imply that we can ever go back to our pre-globalized world of work, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we should be satisfied with this sort of parasitic capitalism where digital firms give very little back to the places in which they are actually embedded in, and relatively atomized workers are left to fend for themselves. So as this sort of work becomes ever more common, I think we can change our expectations, and we can use what we know about the economic geographies of digital work and virtual production networks to envision and hopefully strive towards alternate futures. So instead of imagining digital work as being undertaken in these sorts of digital spaces beyond the realm of regulation and worker-led governance, I think we need to remember that it all happens somewhere. This digital work always has a geography. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was terrific. I think really, really compelling way of unpacking some of those grand visions we hear so much of behind digital development, and giving us the kind of the data-driven perspectives that really help us unpack those and understand disentangle the hype from the reality. Let me hand over now to Gina Porter, our second keynote speaker, who will be giving us an anthropological mixed method approach, which looks at young people and their use of mobile phones in Ghana, South Africa and Malawi. Thank you very much, Gina.
I suppose coming from these issues from quite a different perspective, in that we've been working with young people in very poor communities in 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a DFID ESRC funded project, and so the stories I'm going to tell are really about young people at the coalface and what their lives are like when they're trying to get a job or to do a job. And essentially what we're talking about is working with a mobile phone, very likely a very basic mobile phone. And the work I'm going to talk about is work that's been in collaboration with researchers from University of Cape Coast in Ghana, University of Malawi, and in South Africa with University of Cape Town and Walter Sisulu University. And it's very much a collaborative effort that I'm going to be presenting. So, first of all, technology, jobs. What does this all mean for young people in sub-Saharan Africa? Poor jobs, no jobs. These are the sort of problems that we're talking about. And technology is increasingly part of the picture when you're looking to get a job or work. But it's the mobile phone. And so this is from what's happening in the sites where we worked. So 24 research sites. So in each country, 8 research sites going from urban to peri-urban to rural with services to remote rural into agroecological zones. And we've been working in these 24 sites actually since 2006, because we started off by not being concerned with technology at all. We were looking at young people's physical mobility, getting to services. But actually, as soon as we moved into our research sites, we found that virtual mobility was starting to intervene and change the way young people's lives operated. And quite a big study. We originally worked with 9 to 18-year-olds. When we moved to look specifically at mobile phones, we extended because our young people were moving forward, and we moved on to look at people 9 to 25-year-olds. And lots of different approaches, and I'm not going to talk about methods. You can ask, if you like, about them afterwards. But essentially, we started with co-investigation with young people. We trained young researchers, 11 to 19-year-olds. That their work fed into the questions that we then put in qualitative studies, talking people stories about their mobile phones, and then a big survey, 4,500 young people. So the technology context, and then I talk about the employment context. Well, yeah. Very few people have ever had access to landlines. This was an elite thing to have a phone. But now, mobile phones are there, and yeah, penetration rates over 8% in urban areas. It's changing all the time. It really is something that offers everybody in sub-Saharan Africa. It's seen as something, it's a way forward. The way it's your window on the world, if you like. And the mobile phone has been re-envisioned to suit the African context. You can do SMS, you can buzz, all sorts of ways of really getting a cheap call, cheap contact. And of course, money transfers, M-Pesa, this is Africa. It's fantastic what's happening. And young people are there right at the forefront. For them, this is the way forward. And if you're living in an urban or a peri-urban area, then, for cool youth, this is what you've got to have, a smartphone. And this is the top of your list of your needs. It comes before even smart clothes, smart shoes. You've got to have a phone, because that's what really marks you out, a good phone. And as you move on, you go for a better phone and a better phone. And this is even in very poor communities. So, yeah, just in our research sites, and just looking at the 9 to 18-year-olds, because that's the age group we worked with originally in 2000 from 2006 onwards, you can see the increase in people's ownership, young people's ownership of mobile phones. This is 9 to 18-year-olds. But actually, of course, this tells you nothing about what's really going on, because everybody is lending their phones. Your phone runs out of airtime, you borrow somebody else's phone. Your battery has run down, you borrow somebody else's, maybe a parent's, siblings, neighbours, friends, whatever. But increasingly, you're making use of phones. And we've seen this massive increase in use of phones. So, yeah, 77% using phones in the week before survey in our South African sites. And this is talking about from urban through to remote rural locations. So, yeah, when you've got a phone, it's a symbol that things are working in life. This is from a young woman teacher in Malawi. This is what we heard all over the place. It's a phone that connects you to the world. So then the work context. Yeah, getting a job, doing a job is tough across the research sites where we worked. But there are contrasts, of course, across our study countries. If we look at the 9 to 25-year-olds who are not enrolled in education, then in Malawi and Ghana, that's an awful lot of young people are doing some sort of job. In South Africa, the figures are lower, only half. Because in Ghana and Malawi, okay, the jobs are not brilliant. You're doing poorly paid work, it's probably temporary, poor work conditions, it's in the informal sector. but you're doing something. In South Africa, of course, with a much smaller informal sector, because of the legacy of apartheid, then you've got very high unemployment. Getting a job is really tough. So from our data, we had, these very, very low figures. Only 52% had had some livelihood activity in the last 12 months, at some point in the last 12 months. And that accords rather well with the World Bank data as well. It is very tough. The unemployment rates are very high, especially when you consider the actively discouraged, the young people who've actually, in South Africa, just given up looking for a job because they can't find one. What's the point? So, what about the mobile phone, then, in getting a job, getting work, getting a livelihood? There's been quite a lot of academic literature looking at what's happening in the jobs market and how the mobile phone helps people in trade, for instance, improve their livelihood position. But what seems to be emerging all over the place is that essentially you're more likely to benefit if you're male, if you're more educated, and if you're a woman, you're one of the more privileged women in society. And there's actually not been that much work that's been specifically focused on young people using mobile phones in building a livelihood. But it does seem that given young people's very low status in African society generally, that all sorts of inbuilt inequalities may well be there. And what I'm going to do is to talk about 5 areas where mobile phones are implicated in young people's livelihood strategies and the difficulties for a young person in working with these. First of all, and I'll take mostly probably about job search, very briefly then about using mobile phone to make money and then using it in your job. But one of the big issues, and the one I'll probably spend a bit of time at the end, is to talk about young people, how young people just get resources to keep going without a job through the mobile phone. So first of all, finding a job through the phone. In Malawi, 19% of young people we surveyed had used a phone to help find a job in the last year. This is all the young people 9 through to 25 who are not enrolled in education, mostly young people over the age of about 14, 15. It's 24% in Ghana, but it's nearly half of our young people that we surveyed in South Africa. You're much more likely to use a phone in South Africa, of course, to find a job. A, because you're more likely to have a phone, ownership figures and use figures are much higher. But also because the job sector is much more formally organised. And a lot of the work is more likely to be in the formal sector, not in the informal sector. But when we look at then at how people use their phone to actually find a job, again, it's interesting. In Malawi and Ghana, it's almost every young person is using actually the phone. It's to call a personal contact to help them find a job, whereas it's much lower in South Africa because we're talking about much more about work in the formal sector. But when it comes to internet searches, there are more, of course, more young people with smartphones in South Africa and a much higher emphasis on finding a job than through an internet search. And again, because they're looking at the informal sector. So here we've got somebody talking about how hard it was without a mobile phone to get a job. because he was having to buy a newspaper. But of course, by the time you've got to get the number to phone somebody and borrowed a phone to phone, the job's gone. And, you know, so many young people in South Africa particularly volunteering as a way of trying to get a job, calling the numbers, sending your CV. This young woman, the second quotation, check the internet once a week for any vacancies, find a vacancy, I take the phone contact, call the numbers, normally ask the person if you can send my CV. She actually had got a certificate in computing, but she'd just moved in from rural Limpopo, and she hadn't as yet got anything. Occasionally, people did get the phone in South Africa and did get a job. This was a young lad who was a dropout from school, and somebody had told him that there was a filling station looking for young people, for workers. So he got the number and he immediately called them to check that the job was open. They told them maybe they were closing the next day. I didn't waste any time. And 1 week after, I received a call from them. You see, it's important. You've got to have the phone because they're going to be able to call you. And I went there prepared and I was hired. Fantastic. But for all those stories, those few stories of getting a job, there are many, many more where people just haven't been able to get their job. So this is a young woman in the northwest province. She subscribes to many websites, Job Mail, Career 24. They send emails with job alerts. No fee. Every day I get emails. We're applying, my friends too. Every day we apply, but we don't get any feedback. That's what I hate about the system. It's that constant going for jobs and not getting them. And eventually people just get so fed up. What are they going to do? And of course there is a skills issue. Unless you've really got the skills, is there going to be a job for you? So, for South Africa, certainly, yes, people are using phones to get jobs, to hear about opportunities, but those are very, very few and far between. There are few jobs and few people get them. Okay, you save a bit of money because you don't have to be chasing all over the place. You can phone to see whether the job is still available and so on. But it's tough. And I think one of the things that surprised us was how few enrolled school pupils in South Africa, but also in Ghana and Malawi, how few of them use their phones for job search. And we did wonder if more training there might be useful. Just moving on from job hunting then to using phones in order to, as a way of getting income. There's an awful lot of young people in Ghana and Malawi who are selling airtime, maybe charging batteries, all sorts of jobs that are related actually to the mobile phone. Interestingly, in South Africa, there's much less of such jobs, of that kind of job available. Because, of course, in South Africa, the major supermarkets, ShopRite and so on, they all sell airtime. People have got access to mains electricity, so they don't need to constantly charge their mobile phone and so on. If we move on then to micro-enterprise, yes, young people are using mobile phones in the job. And for all sorts of things, if you're a trader, for building your customer relations, for placing orders, booking transport, big one, chasing debts. You make sure that you have got everybody's phone number so you can chase them when they haven't paid you. But essentially, we thought that there would be more use of phones to really build livelihoods and the people in work. And that was not so much the case as we anticipated, particularly in South Africa. In the service sector, you've got occasional examples in South Africa of young people using their phone quite effectively. There's a young hairdresser, when she started her hairdressing shop, she posted her numbers, and lots of people call her. If it wasn't for my phone, I wouldn't be where I am. So clearly, it's working for her. And then there were various young apprentices, particularly in Ghana, where they were using their phone in work, actually getting on-the-job training. So there's this young electrician, his boss was helping him to resolve a problem in a client's house over the phone. So, you can get things working sometimes quite well. I think one of the most interesting areas, one where I'm particularly interested, is in the transport sector. And this isn't Uber. This is just young people who, if they're working for a taxi business, driving a car for somebody, not Uber, then they need a phone. So you've got this young man saying, as soon as he got his first pay packet, he got a phone. I had no choice but to buy a cell phone. You snooze, you lose. And that's actually, and since then, I think now, I don't think I've come across any taxi drivers who don't have a phone. Everybody has to have a phone. In Malawi, it was even the bicycle taxi drivers who were finding that they'd got to have a mobile phone, because otherwise they lost business. Criminality, of course, is another issue. A lot of stories around the mobile phone being stolen, young people being blamed for this, all sorts of scams and so on, but I'm not going to talk about that. The other one thing I do want to talk about is how youths use the phone as a safety net. You don't have a job, you've got no income, what do? You make sure you phone your relatives generally. Older aunts and uncles are key source of support. You may phone for money, you may phone for material goods like shoes, clothes, books. And this is actually very, very, surprisingly huge numbers of calls are all around asking for help for money or for material goods. This young man in South Africa, working in an urban area in the Eastern Cape, his mum's selling vegetables in the village, and she sends him money and his brother money to keep them going through the week while he searches for a job in town. And that's what keeps him going. He does occasional things, but essentially it's those resources that are so essential to his living. So, to conclude, lots of young people have got mobile phones now, right across sub-Saharan Africa. It's very hard to find a young person who hasn't got access to a mobile phone, even in these very poor locations where we've been working. They've got these phones, but still consistently disadvantaged in access to employment and income. Sometimes they will get a job through the phone, but most often they're frustrated. Phones are not enough. Low levels of education are part of the issue. It is so difficult. But of course, if you don't have much opportunity to learn, to get work experience, what do? You go and try and volunteer and get some experience, but it's hard. There are all those other young people searching for a job. Young people are looking to the sort of bonding capital, to their relatives, to keep them going, to cushion them against extreme poverty. But young people want work. There is so much frustration, so much despair, so much apathy, which we've certainly met across our sites, but particularly in South Africa. I just wanted to finish with this photo. These were young people they were all unemployed graduates from Walter Sisulu University who worked in our Eastern Cape survey. They were fantastic. This was a brilliant team. But they haven't got jobs. They're graduates, but they still haven't got jobs. If you want a job, you've got to be prepared to move. You've got to really, really work hard at it. It's a very acute unemployment situation in South Africa. But overall, I think the thing we can say is that unless the overall basket of opportunities grows, mobile phones are not going to be the answer. And young people are just putting so much faith in the phone, very often, particularly in South Africa. But there's so much competition for jobs. You think, is this just a sort of neoliberal technique? It's so frustrating.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gina. Mark, Gina, thank you. I think you've done exactly what we'd hoped in these two keynotes. We really wanted to, having presented a whole series of challenges, we wanted to really try and understand what empirical research can do in helping us understand the human impacts of digitisation on work, on communities and on individuals, and really help ground our understanding of the impacts of digitalisation on people's capabilities to live the kinds of lives and work the kinds of work that they value. So I'm really, really grateful to both of you for that. I know there's probably a lot of questions and comments, but given that we're actually running a little bit late now, what I'd like to do is to ask you to take those questions and comments into the break with you. We'll stop for coffee now for 30 minutes. We'll bring you back at 22. We've got a participatory session that follows this, so there'll be an ample opportunity for you to engage with each other, for you to talk, and if you've got specific questions for Mark and Gina, do find them in the break. But I think now's quite a good time for us to stop and take a break. And do also, we've got time for 3 rounds of people to go in and do the work you want installation just next to the collector room. So, and I think they can take 15 people at a time, and each round takes about 10 minutes. So do find your way there as well. They'll also be running at lunchtime. So will you please join me in thanking Mark and Gina once again.